Hello and welcome back to Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. Today we'll be having a stab at history, writing the history of the last 4 years, perhaps the next 4 years, and what comes after that, particularly as regards the end or the start of the Trump era, what it means for the centre-right in America and indeed in Australia. To help me with that, I have none other than my regular co-host, Dr. Chris Berg from RMIT University.
Thank you, Scott.
Chris, welcome. Also joining me is Andrew Bushnell, Research Fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs.
G'day, Scott.
Great to have you. Don't forget, Looking Forward is a podcast of the Institute of Public Affairs. If you're not already a member, please do go to ipa.org.au to see how you can join or donate. Chris, I'll ask you in a moment to set up today's discussion about the post-election wrap-up. And of course, later in the show, we'll have our usual books and culture segment. But I might take this opportunity also to thank you, the listener, for being with us on the journey for Looking Forward for the past 90 plus episodes over the last 2 years. It's been a fabulous experience for me, and I hope for Chris and the listeners and all the wonderful special guests that we've had along the way. I'm saying this now because next week will actually be our final episode. Due to the pressure of other work and the desire to do more specials as part of the amazing digital output of the Institute of Public Affairs, more interviews, more documentaries, more topical takes on what's going on. We will be putting Looking Forward into abeyance, apart from the odd special from time to time. So again, thank you for your support. You can continue to track the work of the IPA via our website and our social media channels, and there'll certainly be no shortage of terrific digital product in 2021 and beyond. But after next week, that'll be it for Looking Forward as a weekly podcast. Chris.
Yes, that's right. It's been an awesome pleasure. I think we'll do some reflections on it next week. But, you know, I guess Donald Trump has lost the election. So what's the point of the podcast anymore, really? Why continue?
How could it possibly be as interesting as it's been over the past 2 years?
And there's a vaccine as well. So it just really
can't talk about COVID either. Yeah.
So unfortunately, Scott and I have run out of things to say. So we thought we'd wrap the podcast up.
Speak for yourself, Berg. No, but yes, less facetiously, but indeed. But we'll talk.
So let's talk about this week, shall we? So we actually did a couple of wrap-up episodes, well, not a couple of wrap-up, but we have had a number of episodes on the US election. Obviously, we had one, turns out, on the day of the night of the election, US time. With Gideon Rosner and Morgan Begg. I thought it would be, and we thought that it would be interesting to, now that the election is wrapping up, and maybe we'll talk about how wrapped up it is, but it would be interesting to talk about, and important to talk about, the legacy that Trump has had, not just on the Republican Party, because that's interesting, but it's also, you know, not Australia. But what is legacy that administration has had on the free market movement in Australia and around the world? One of the long run themes that we've had on this podcast has been the tension in the coalition or otherwise between libertarians, classical liberals, conservatives, and the new generation of national or nationalist conservatives, or however they like to be described. Now that it looks like Donald Trump has lost the 2020 election and Joe Biden will be the president, I thought it'd be good to reflect on that legacy. Why don't we start, though, with the very practical questions? Now, I think that Donald Trump is doing himself an incredible disservice, and certainly doing an incredible disservice to those who would support his political revolution by challenging the election at this stage. But Andrew, what I want to ask you, as someone who's possibly more sympathetic to the Trump movement than I, is over the last couple of weeks, how have you seen or reassessed or reconfirmed your view about the evolution of center-right politics in the US and the world? How is the post-election affected or not affected how you think about it?
It's a good question, because the last month has been, I think we could say, highly unusual. In that,
just a tad. It's a bit odd.
But what I would say is that now, in any situation like this, you're going to get a few people who try to take advantage of it to boost themselves. Colloquially called grifting. And so there's been a few fanciful claims made about, I think, what happened in the election. And some people have tried to take advantage of that. But I think overall what the way it should be viewed is that as Trump looks like he's moving to the exit, and there's only one really outstanding court case now, he's setting himself up to be the leader of the opposition. Basically, he's saying, I'm not going anywhere. If you believe the reports, I think it was in Axios, he's even planning to have a counter rally on Inauguration Day, which should set the tone for the next 4 years. And I think his supporters will be with him, because there's no concern here about undermining the legitimacy of a Biden presidency or anything like that. All of those complaints are simply nonsense in the wake of what happened to Trump. In the way that Trump's presidency was deliberately destroyed from the outset by people within his own administration, within the executive over which he was nominally the head, within the Republican Party, and of course the lies told about him by the Democratic Party. There's really no concern. There's no reason for Trump not to be combative like this. And I think the question can be turned around. If Trump, by some fluke, were able to overturn the election based on some legal means, if the Supreme Court somehow determined that there was some sort of illegality, and of course it's quite speculative, and I'm not saying that that's what would happen, but in the hypothetical, to what would his opponents appeal? Why would they say that if all of the procedures are followed and the combative tone is followed to the nth degree and produces this remarkable, what would be a historical result of changing an election after the fact, suppose that happened based on an entirely legal procedure, to what would opponents of Trump appeal, having said all along that what they're trying to do is defend the very institutions that would, in this hypothetical, produce that result? They couldn't actually do anything. There's no reason for Trump not to exhaust every single procedural step. And especially when you think about it in terms of setting himself up to lead the opposition to Biden and essentially do to them what they did to him.
Yeah, I don't think.
But there is a reason not to do that, Andrew, and it's that, I mean, you pointed out that some grifters have come up with some spectacularly wild claims. I mean, one of those people making those spectacularly wild claims is the president. So it's not as if he's been only concerned with the narrowest of claims of election misconduct. It's that he has been the primary vehicle for the wildest of possible claims, and with the Sidney Powell and the Linwood and all.
Are these claims any more wild than the idea that the sitting president of the United States is a Russian asset?
So no. But so
I mean, I think that's a relevant question.
But I agree with you. The idea that Donald Trump was actually a Russian asset from the 1980s was insane, but is no defense of a similarly insane claim made by Donald Trump. Now, I agree that all people in politics are bad, but all people in politics being bad still means individuals in politics are bad. And I think that we have to be mature enough to be able to point that out. Like it is madness. Now, why should we care? Okay, so why should we care, and why should we as Australians care about this? It's because the Trump election of 2016 meant so much to the centre right and realigned so much within the centre right that when its sort of nominal leader acts in this way, it is discrediting to that change. I think, Andrew, you should be angry with him for letting your views down.
I wonder, discrediting in the eyes of who? And I think this gets to the fundamental question that Trump has raised. I think this is the legacy, when we talk about Australia, I think this is the thing that we really take from it, is basically that Trump, for all of his faults and all the things he's got wrong, the point about the thing that Trump represents is basically being on the front foot and not caring about what people who hate you think. That's what he represents in the culture, is to push back, and so the idea that in some way Trump being what he's always been, which is a wild outlier in a way, in his willingness to take on his haters and stand there and cop their abuse. This is why his posture right now in this last month is actually has been important to his supporters, is because he's almost anti-fragile to attacks. He's even anti-fragile to loss. I mean, I think that's what we might find, is that because his position is, the support for him is based on his strength under these kinds of attacks, and he's inviting more attacks on himself. And I think that symbolic power is the thing that people have never really fully grasped.
To that point, the Democrat fantasy before the election was that if Trump lost, he would not only use every legal means to avoid having to hand over power, he would use extra legal means to avoid power. And the idea of tanks rolling down Constitution Avenue was sort of conjured up as a likely outcome of a Trump loss. But I like that idea of an anti-fragile response, because of course for Trump in many ways he didn't want to lose for various reasons, including his own ego and the support base and the people that he wants to represent politically. But he didn't have to win either, and so this is a strategy where.
But Scott,
the point is, Chris, he will leave the White House.
He
will leave.
But what is it? So what is it that you want out of a political leader?
But all this stuff about gentle handovers and all the whining that we're hearing from the Democrats. I wanted to meet with the head of this department, and there was a political advisor from the Republicans there.
Sure.
I mean, this is no different to what Theodore Roosevelt did. 100 years ago, where some presidents refuse to go gently into that good night. Not all of them just want to worry about their presidential library. Some.
So let me make a point.
Politics.
And to jump off what Andrew has said. So you're right that Donald Trump, his virtue in the eyes of many, and certainly in the eyes of his supporters, is that he doesn't care. He doesn't care what the opposition think, and he doesn't care what. He will be Trump no matter what happens. He will be the most Trump he can be. Now, it turns out, though, that being the most Trump he can be has meant that he's lost an election as a first-term president, because being the most Trump you can be brings out the opposition because you don't care what they think. Now, to my mind, that strikes me as a point against him if what we care about is positive public policy change in the direction of liberty. Now, if we care about Donald Trump as an individual, then maybe losing is not actually a loss. He will survive this. I don't care whether he survives this. I care about the public policy agenda. I care about can we get deregulation? Can we get good conservative or classical liberal judges? And I'm yet to hear an argument that having Donald Trump for one term was better than having a less Trumpy Republican for 2 terms. And I think that's the burden that has to be proven.
But I think you got to take a longer historical view about what.
That's all I do. I just
about what's being attempted here. So you ask, well, what are the policy outcomes? Well, we've got better policy outcomes in the last 4 years. Maybe. I mean, who knows? But these last 4 years weren't the whole game. The game is actually to have an administration that actually represents these voters and doesn't thwart what they want. I mean, even something as simple as building a wall, literally something that humans have been doing for thousands of years, was impossible, even though Donald Trump was nominally the head of the executive. That is what is actually at stake in the long run historical game that is being played here. And that's why, things like Trump won't leave, he'll put tanks on the streets. He doesn't need to do that, because the point is not about exercising political power in the short term. This is the thing. It's about access to political power and using it and being allowed to use it in the longer term. It's not about these 4 years. The people
Is that an argument that the next Republican president will now have the ability to do more because of Trump?
What Trump has succeeded in highlighting is that for the people who support him, the system is now, as he always says, is rigged against them. How do we know that this is a change that he has managed to highlight? Well, Trump lost in an extremely unusual way in the historical pattern of presidential elections in the United States. He is the first nominee since 1960 to win Ohio and Florida and not win, which are generally considered fairly representative states of Middle America. He won 18 of 19 historic swing counties across the country, usually considered bellwethers. What happened in this election was highly unusual. It's the first election where turnout in heavily Democratic cities was able to swamp the votes of regional and outer suburban voters in key states. And what that signals is a shift, right, in how America is governed, and whose views actually have access to executive power. And 2016, when he won, which was also a highly unusual election in many ways, not least of which was Trump himself, the result of that was actually a concerted effort to thwart the implementation of the policies that he'd run on. And so Trump's value as an historic figure is to make clear to people that their aspirations for their country, their ability to have their values represented in the executive of their country, is now severely limited. And something has to be done about that, in the sense of that's what needs to be campaigned on, is bringing that back and not accepting the inexorable slide towards permanent Democratic Party rule. That's actually the longer run historical game. That's why Trump himself will probably stick around as leader of the opposition. It's why his positions will continue to circulate on the centre-right, is because there's a significant number of voters who feel as though it's getting harder and harder for them to actually win political power and use it. And that's separate from if you actually could exercise this power, what would you do? Once the dog catches the car, what does he do? Yeah. But there is the question of the car is driving away faster and faster from the dog.
Can I actually want to have a go at the first draft of history, and
that is a beautiful metaphor for the whole administration.
Well, it is. I mean, this is the thing about the dog that called the car, which was the Trump insurrection, and what an amazing insurrection it was. I still don't believe any other Republican candidate could have won. So there is no counterfactual in which you have a two-term Republican against Hillary. There is no counterfactual in which a two-term Republican Party comes. But one of the things I've been grappling with was I came of age in the Reagan era, and And so one of the things I've grappled with over the last 4 years is to see the Trumpists essentially denigrating the legacy of the Gipper, because I lived it in real time. I saw the outcome being the end of the Cold War with virtually complete victory, a vindication of anti-communism, a vindication of fusionism. I saw morning in America, the economy turned around through tight money, tax cuts, at least a notional commitment to smaller government. And then all of this was denigrated by the Trump insurgents. And I think one of the things that we'll see in history is not so much that the insurrection changed the Republican Party from one of Reagan, or God forbid, one of sort of the East Coast establishment Bush family, to one of Trump. We'll probably see the continuities, because Reagan wasn't Reagan when he was Reagan. This idea of the historical Reagan that the Trump insurrectionists painted was not what it was like at the time. He was seen as an incredibly divisive figure as well, Chris. So, this Joe Biden line, it's not the Republican Party of your fathers. This idea that, Reagan was a statesman. Reagan was a statesman and Trump's a vandal. They ran for 8 years on Reagan being the vandal, and the continuities are they both put tax cuts through. They both tried to rein back the administrative state with limited effectiveness. And Reagan believed in global engagement and ally building. Trump was an isolationist, but the outcome is the same in both cases, in that you spend a heck of a lot of money on the military and you are ready for anything. So I actually think as the styles of the individuals recede into history, and they will eventually, there will actually be seen as more continuities between the two administrations than is currently realised.
I think in the telling of it too, if I could just add to that, I think that's a really good point. I think in the historical, when we look back, maybe not so much in the policy sense, but I think there will be a conscious effort to connect Trump to a continuous history. I think that's generally important because revolutions are bad, right? You don't want to create discontinuity. And so placing Trump in a fuller historical context will be an important undertaking for whoever follows him anyway, because they don't want to jettison the parts of, say, Reaganism that are still incredibly popular. I mean, Reagan was hugely popular and successful. Why would you're not going to cut yourself, rhetorically in the Trump era, it's been about positioning them against that. But I think in the longer run, they'll try and forge some continuity, because ultimately discontinuity, revolution is bad. I mean, Americans lapse into revolutionary talk because of how they talk about the founding of their country. So every time, Gingrich gets control of Congress, it's a Republican revolution.
This is like your man Michael Anton with the Flight 93 election. Like, he wrote that great essay on why 2016 was the Flight 93 election and we have to storm the cabin. But every day is Flight 93 for Michael Anton. It's like, come on, mate, you can't keep that.
Well, I think everything has to be the apocalypse.
That is permanent revolution.
No, but I think that does touch on what I was saying, is that Trump lost in a highly unusual way. This can't really be stressed enough, that in any other era of American history, the coalition of voters that Trump put together would have been enough to win, but they weren't in this election. And that tells you something about the country. And I think that's going to be the hard part, because, Reagan Democrats, put Reagan over the top and made him this huge historic success. Trump won a lot of those voters as well. But they're just not as important electorally as they used to be. And that hurts.
I don't know that we can assess how unusual that spread of coalition and states is until we sort of see a few more elections after the fact. But even so, even like granting that argument, doesn't that suggest that Trump as a unique figure brought out the vote both on his side and against him, but more people didn't like that style than didn't. So, yes, Scott, you're right. Reagan was described by the left as divisive in lots of ways, but he also managed to hold the country, hold the presidency again, and then gave it to his vice president afterwards. We can't until 2020 assess the success of Trump by the fact that he was popular enough to win in 2016, and then suggest that, well, 2020 was just weird, too unusual. These ideas are still incredibly popular, and he's still incredibly
No, because if we
popular
see the same pattern in subsequent elections, then this election will be considered a watershed. Now, one way that it was unusual is the incredibly high rate of mail-in voting because of the pandemic, and you could play counterfactual games with that all day long. But having created the systems for mail-in voting, that may well continue into future election cycles. More and more people may vote that way. Early voting, I mean, one of the reasons that Trump lost is that he put together this incredible barnstorming campaign in the last month of the campaign, to rank on par or exceed barnstorming runs from history. But by that point, a lot of people had already voted. I mean, by the time Trump started his barnstorming after himself having coronavirus, a lot of people had already voted, and they'd voted, I think his response to the pandemic hurt him, and I think getting the virus, was an embarrassment, and I think that people were voting at that time when that happened. So that's a little bit unusual. But what I mean by saying that it's unusual is that even if it becomes a norm, it will always be discontinuous with how American elections have been decided in the past. And so it marks a kind of watershed. And if we're talking about the future of the Republican Party, or even more broadly, what lessons we can take here in Australia from it, I think that watershed is going to be a really important marker, because how do you win? How do you put together
but then on the other hand, Andrew, they held that they held on to the Senate, and they did very well in the House. You see.
Well, again, that's pretty unusual too.
The issue for me,
it's unusual. Sorry, on that, it's because he was uniquely unpopular. Turns out Republicans aren't unpopular.
But he wasn't unpopular with Republicans. Yeah. So why would you come and vote? And this is really interesting.
Because the marginal voters, the ones who actually make a decision, they're like, yeah, look, sometimes I vote Republican, and there's no reason not to do that this time. But I don't like Trump.
No, but there's more. There is the case that some people who are nominally Republican would tell pollsters, I support Trump. So Trump was polling about 95% approval with Republicans. So you're not leaving a huge group of people there who are willing to come along, vote Republican in other, and lower down on the ticket and not vote for Trump. I mean, I think that's somewhat unusual. I mean, again, yes, the most unusual thing in these elections is Trump himself. There's no question about that. Like, he is the real thing that makes these unique. But that said, there are other things that Trump did that were historically unusual. His high support among Latinos, particularly in Florida, the Cuban population there. Yeah. There are different ways that he was unusual as well.
And that's the future. I was reading a New Yorker piece that a friend sent me. It was the week of the election. It was talking about different scenarios for the Republicans, and one scenario was like restoration, that there'd be this sort of snapback to what the Republican Party was before Trump came along, and that's like then your candidate would be Nikki Haley. Or the other one is to complete this process of reversal, where the Republican Party becomes the party of the common man, and not just whites either, but completes a sort of a class and culture-based reversal, which is actually going to keep on doing even better and better with Latino and other minority voters. Even, Trump, I think, was polling 30+% amongst African American men under 50. So there's opportunities there, and that candidate is Marco Rubio. He wants to complete the process reversal. I got to tell you though, what worries me, and I think that is what is prospective for Trump and the centre right around the world, is that reversal. What worries me though is if Trump is the leader of the opposition, the process will not be completed. It just reminds me too much of Joe Bjelke-Peterson in Queensland, Jeff Kennett in Victoria, other strong man leaders. When they're out of office but still in power, they have a corrosive effect on those who come after. They're always, anyone who comes after looks small in their shadow while they're still on the scene. And if I can see why Donald Trump's not riding off into the sunset. What worries me is that he won't be securing his legacy. He'll be destroying it, just like Teddy Roosevelt screwed the Republican Party. And that's what could happen.
And that's a way to think about what the implications are for the future here, particularly in Australia. So I think there are two possible interpretations of what's gone on. One is that there's a general movement, a general realignment around policy choices and around who those policy choices are sold to. So again, that's the potentially multi-ethnic, but certainly a more working class conservatism. Now, working class conservatism is not a new idea by any stretch of the imagination. And again, Reagan had a lot of that, but Trump has made it.
It was the original premise of Tory democracy as well.
Yeah, but it seems it's a big part of the Trump story. The other interpretation, though, is that there's something just special about Donald Trump that the conservative movement just really, really liked. Now, that's because he's an unusual character. That's because he doesn't care what the left thinks. That's because it looks like
he's entertaining. He's entertaining.
Yeah, he's funny.
This is the other thing.
You want to listen to him.
Yeah,
he's funny. That's the genuinely, thing the left never wouldn't got. It be funny to see if he was president? Was a big part, I think, of 2016.
No. I mean, he's actually
funny.
He's funny. You're listening to him. His speeches are hilarious.
But if that's the case, and it doesn't have to be an either or. But if that's the dominant part, then there are no lessons, right? The Australian conservative movement can't just find a funny New York developer and pop him up and get him to talk about immigrants or something. We can't do that. We'd be stupid to try. And it's the same again for the Republican Party. It's either Trump or no one. Or if it's this more general change, then that is replicable.
No, I think Trump definitely. There are a fair number of people who are probably Trump only voters. They're Trump voters. They're not Republican voters. They're not really interested in a realignment. They like the idea of Trump, and that's why the other option, looking forward, would be
to coin a phrase.
Yeah, completely accidental and stupid. But looking to the future, the other option would be another outsider candidate who is able to tap into that same feeling. Now, you're not going to find another one who was a TV star. Basically,
you're not going to drop Tucker Carlson. You're going to drop Tucker Carlson.
But it could be someone who's an outsider, but somewhat more serious. From time to time, you see generals get interested in politics, things like that. So it could be someone from outside the mainstream political bureaucracy that's able to tap into the same vein, assuming. And that's where I think perhaps I would differ from you, Chris, in that I think that there is a vein to tap into. I think Trump was uniquely placed to tap into it, but the vein exists separate from Trump, at least to some extent. I think when we look at
and some of it's outside of politics. I'm not sorry, just to support your point. I don't want to take you away from it. It's like Bob Hawke coming into the Labor Party. He'd built his profile outside of the party, outside of the parliament. Malcolm Turnbull, in a way, had built his profile outside of the parliament. Ruined the Liberal Party, but that's a different story. But yes, there's always opportunities for someone to come in from outside.
Yeah. And that would actually be, if that became a trend, that would actually be a very positive thing. The professionalisation of the political class has been a real driver of this gap opening up between the political class and the people they ostensibly represent. So to the extent that Trump might represent in some way a willingness to look beyond that group of people and say, well, actually, we can install as our representative really anyone who agrees with us,
that's what the Tea Party was about too. Pre-Trump, the Tea Party was an insurrection movement within the Republican Party. Was to look at their representatives in Congress and say, I'm sick of these guys. And that's why they're hopeless. So let's just get rid of them and put someone else in.
And that's why, talk about political realignment and things like that. What it actually boils down to is representative democracy. Taking that seriously, that the people who are in positions of power through the democratic process are supposed to represent the voters. They're not supposed to represent their own interests, at least not all of the time, and they're not supposed to spend their days feathering their nests. The United States, this is one of the incredible things, and this is where Australia is different, and one of the reasons why we haven't seen the same sort of thing. The United States is seemingly willing, to tolerate an incredible level of corruption. We would not tolerate a senator magically having $100 million fortune. We just wouldn't do it. Barry O'Farrell resigned over a bottle of wine that he forgot to keep the receipt. In the United States, they just have these senators with rows of houses. It's like, I own that town. What? So, in the United States, and this is
you have to own a proportion of the state.
Yeah, to put my monarchist hat on.
It's the ultimate in representative democracy.
It's Republican. The United States. What Trump has proved is the United States is just another corrupt American republic. The outlier on that continent is Canada. Everything below the 49th parallel is more or less the same system of government.
Just some of them speak Spanish or Portuguese, and some of them speak English.
It's all the same regicidal mania.
So is I actually think that we're making some progress. But does that mean that is the lesson for Australia that Trump is, and I accept your point that there is a vein to tap into, but is the lesson for Australia that it's not about the policy so much, it's not about that suite of ideological stances, it's the fact that it's an outsider who's willing to to disrupt the existing moribund political system, and if so, does that mean it doesn't matter on what side of politics they come from?
Well, I think it's a good question, but I think sort of the left-wing populist idea is just not that divorced from what Bernie Sanders, for example, what he actually wants, or what the Greens in Australia actually want, isn't that far removed from what the bureaucracy is doing anyway. So it's not really an outsider kind of movement in the way that. The way I would put it is this, and is that if we broaden this to the future of the centre right and what that kind of politics will become, I think the trend is for the breakdown is becoming the centre right has the opportunity to become the side of politics that defends particularity in all of its forms. The idea that our country is a particular place that is capable of making up its own mind. And then further down, these institutions have particular functions; they don't need to be rationalised. That versus what is the great project of essentially Enlightenment political philosophy of turning every person and every institution into exactly the same thing.
The Kantian project.
So the breakdown is between, the left talks about equality and things like that, but the breakdown is really particularity versus generality. And I think that the trend is towards particularity and towards the establishment in the state of a particular set of values that are rooted in history and shared by the people. That's what populism actually means. And this is, in a broad abstract sense, in a sense that's more abstract than conservatives would normally talk about, this is actually the meaning of Toryism, which is the union of political and spiritual power, symbolised historically in the king. And that's that fusion. Just bear with me. But it's that union. It's that
we are on a clock here.
Yeah, but it's that union. No, but
It's
that union of political and normative power that particularity actually picks out.
We are going to have to leave it there, Andrew, because I have one final thing to say, and then Chris has one final thing to say before we throw to books and culture. My observation, my thought that I want to leave you with, and that was awesome, but we are on a clock because the great special guest coming in. My worry about this kind of politics, though, is that you will see in the Morrison government that they will justify anything on the grounds of, this is our new Tory conservatism. This is conservatism of the common people. We're not worried. We don't want to be ideological. Morrison's always saying, I'm not worried about ideology. What he means is that just becomes a cover for, I'll do whatever's pragmatic to get me through the day. I'll fiddle with any legislation. I'll let my ministers do whatever they want, whatever they can get through the Senate. It will be the absolute exhaustion of ideas on the centre right. And what this will not be a philosophically conservative government. It will not be a Tory government. It will not be one nation conservatism, to use the British phrase. It will just be a government of, we'll just do whatever it takes to get us to the next election, and then we'll cobble together a great marketing campaign to retroactively justify it and to make up some more crap we can promise the voters, who will hopefully give us another 3 years. That is always the worry on the centre right, and thank God for ideologues like Ronald Reagan, who actually read far more books than he was ever given credit for, and actually had a philosophy. Well, that's what is always at issue with the centre right. That's why we need the Institute of Public Affairs, Chris.
And that's I'm sorry to spoil the ad. And that's the value of ideology. It's not that you're just generically pushing against the public service because, you know, they're the public service and they are annoying elites. It's because you have a vision of the world that you want. And I worry that this populist movement is just the opposition, not the creation of the better, freer world that I think I desire.
There you go. 3 awesome closing comments from Andrew, me, and you, Chris. But it is that part of the program where we do have to segue into our books and culture segment. And Chris, please start.
Thanks, Scott. So I have been watching. I have continued to read the Gotham book, which, as I said, is unholy lengthy. The history of New York, which I think last time you were on the show, Andrew, we were able to talk about it. It is a fantastic book.
You should have done it chapter by chapter. Your culture pick each week was a chapter of Gotham.
That would have been much more valuable, wouldn't it? But in fact, today I would like to talk to you about a show called The World According to Jeff Goldblum. So this is an incredibly lightweight documentary series on Disney Plus that I'm sure anybody's got Disney Plus, and if you've got Disney Plus, you definitely have children. If you've got Disney Plus, you've probably skipped over before. We sat down and watched it as a family because the thing about having kids, and my kids are now 9 and 6, is you're constantly looking for things that you can watch as a family. And because they're of that age that we can't really watch M-rated things, so we can't watch the best stuff. So you're constantly hunting for something you can watch together.
This is why Disney is a massive corporation which makes a lot of money.
It is. It's precisely marketed to basically me. It's got to be adequate for the parents and enjoyable for the children. Anyway, so this documentary series is Jeff Goldblum just investigating things. So, for example, he investigates sneakers, ice cream, tattoos, denim, barbecue, gaming, just really nouns. Jeff Goldblum investigates nouns. Now, Jeff Goldblum, of course, is a fantastic actor and most iconically from the Jurassic Park series. The thing that really struck me, though, watching this is I'm sure, Scott, you've definitely seen Being John Malkovich, and Andrew, you would have seen it as well. What I love about Being John Malkovich is that it's John Malkovich doing a self-parody of himself as people imagine John Malkovich to be, very stern and serious and obsessed with his art. And he's taking the piss out of himself. I can't help but watch this and think this is Jeff Goldblum playing the character called Jeff Goldblum, pretending to do a documentary. Some people might find it a bit much, and it can be a bit much, but it is nonetheless something perfectly adequate you can watch with your preteen children.
He's always like that, though, isn't he?
What's
Jeff Goldblum?
What's the Hulk movie or the Thor movie? Is it Thor 3 where...
the Thor Ragnarok, where he plays but there is prancing about. Now,
but that's a caricature of Jeff Goldblum as well. So
look, eventually we all become characters of ourselves, and I guess I'm there too.
Some more than others, Chris. Some more than others.
Some more than others. But it just feels like a character, and maybe the character merges into himself over time.
Good. So
it's good fun.
If you got kids, yep, go for it. After you've watched all 23 movies, Marvel movie
else
is on Disney Plus.
That's also there.
Yep.
Is Jurassic Park the one that people think of with Jeff Goldblum, or is it Independence Day? I mean, as you were saying, most iconically, or his most iconic role, I immediately drifted to him somehow bringing down an alien spaceship with a virus.
What about the fly?
That is your worst opinion, and that is your worst opinion. It is unambiguously the Jurassic Park mathematician.
It was the fly that launched him as an actor. Goodness. Well, I have a book, so you don't have a book, do you?
No, I have a movie.
Right. So maybe I should go next, Chris, because I actually have a book.
Yeah. Smart it up a bit for us, would you, Scott?
Yeah, very good. So not a new book, but haunting the bargain pile of quality bookshops, I came across Jonathan Swift, His Life and His World, by Professor Leo Damrosch from Harvard University. It was actually like a 2012, 2013 publication, but awesome. And I'm always going to grab it from the bargain table, not just because it's only $20 instead of like the $60 you pay for a new work of that magnitude. It hits all the buttons for me. It's refers to the long 18th century, which is like my favourite period. It's everything from the effective close of the English Civil War with the Glorious Revolution in 1688 up to the end of the Napoleonic era. That's when the world, or Britain at least, became modern. It was unashamedly parliamentary. The Civil War was closed. So fascinating period in history. I'm into it through Dr. Johnson and Edmund Burke and all sorts of things. Didn't know much about Swift, though. Knew he's the author of Gulliver's Travels, which is such an amazing, excellent satire disguised as a children's book. I've never been able to get into it because I didn't know what it was satirising. So when I see a book, I'm triggered by a title like His Life and His World. It's going to explain it all to me.
This is really smashing some political actors I have no idea about.
That's right. Yeah, the bloody Duke of Marlborough, the arch enemy of Jonathan Swift. Okay. Take that, Duke. Anyway, it was very, very good. I did learn a lot more about him. He was... the other reason I didn't know as much about him is I'm unashamedly a follower of the Whig view of history, the parliamentarians who asserted the supremacy of Parliament against the King. Swift was much more, he'd been in that camp, but he much more allied himself to the Tories, the Country Party, the party of squires, of the established church. He was in the established church. He was in the Church of Ireland. All he wanted was a bishopric. Like, not much. I just want a nice pay packet in a cushy English bishopric. Couldn't get one. Had to settle for being Dean of St Patrick's in Ireland. Later became, even though he was from the established church, the Anglo section of the population, which was lucky to be 10% of the then Irish public, the ruling class, but he became a champion of Ireland and is remembered by Irish of all denominations as someone who is very, very good at sticking it up the English. And this was why his career as a church figure went nowhere while his writing career took off, because he was very, very good at sticking it up people, and published all of these pamphlets, had to do most of them anonymously because he would have been either done for defamation, libel or treason at various times. So he ruined his actual career, but is remembered as a writer, and did all of that, as I say. He'd had a very good time in England. He was nearly on the cusp under Queen Anne, the last of the Tory monarchs. But when she died, everything turned, to dust, and he had to escape back to Ireland. But out of that, you get a masterwork like Gulliver's Travels, the famous story of in the land of Lilliput, amongst the little people who were 6 inches high, and tied him down and had their stupid obsessions, had a civil war over whether or not you should start an egg with the big end or the little end, and all this kind of thing. That's entered folklore, never been out of print. So that's my recommendation, Chris. An actual book, Jonathan Swift.
An actual book, very impressive.
If you go into readings or probably Glee books or anywhere like that, you'll find a
just
copy
a bookshop,
floating.
really, just a bookshop.
Well, yeah, but like it's 7 or 8 years old, so they've got to be able to carry some inventory. It's got to be a good bookshop.
Fair enough.
Not going to riff there anywhere. Weak view of history, Andrew.
Yeah, I was wondering if that was like baiting me or not.
I was just throwing it over the fence. I was going to say.
All right, yeah, go, Andrew. Weak view of history.
Well, I mean, progress is a lie. What was that about becoming a caricature of yourself, Chris?
And playing the role of Peter Hitchens at the IPA is none other than Andrew Bushnell. Thank you. We'll be back with more next week. No, anyway.
One man who did actually achieve something akin to progress at the very least was the American pilot Chuck Yeager, who passed away yesterday at the age of 97. Most famous for being the man who broke the sound barrier, is officially credited with doing it. There's like as with any such moment, there's a dispute about whether anyone had done it before, but he's credited with it. So my culture pick in honour of Chuck Yeager is the 1983 classic film, The Right Stuff, by Philip Kaufman, based on the book by Tom Wolfe. Now this year, actually, I think it was might have been Disney as well, Chris, made a remake of this, a series, which I haven't seen, because there's really no reason to remake a film as good as this one. And there's really no reason to make a series that's a remake of a film that's as long as this one.
It goes forever. It's fantastic, but
it's an amazing film. It goes for 3 hours. It was a box office disaster because, as cool as test pilots are, like it's kind of a niche interest for 3 hours. But I mean, highly recommended. But like Chuck Yeager, you look at his life story. I've got an obituary of him in front of me, and he served as a pilot in World War II. Famously he successfully shot down 5 enemy planes in a single day. And then after the war, he became the lead test pilot in the program that would eventually become the Mercury program, which led to the space program. And so, an important role, not just in aviation history, but then in the way that the Americans were able to build on that, win the space race. I've spoken on this podcast at least once before, probably several times before, about just what an achievement that was. And this guy was foundational to it. After being a test pilot in that program for a long time, he served again in Vietnam, flying bombers. He retired in the 70s as a brigadier general. And he was, I think he was given the US Medal of Freedom by George Bush Jr., and promoted again. So when he died, he was a major general in the Air Force. Just an incredible life. And this film, The Right Stuff, starts with Chuck Yeager because he's right at the start of it, played by Sam Shepard, and it traces the whole program. And so Chuck Yeager is kind of the foundation of this, and the film kind of comes back to him at the end. I think 16 years after the film starts or something like that, quite a long time anyway, of him flying yet another prototype plane to try and escape the atmosphere and crashing. And of course he walks away because he had
from the burning wreckage.
Yeah, and it's just a very
what a guy.
Like this is like the archetypal like American man of action, cool figure that their popular culture has promoted around the world. And also,
but he was a real guy.
And he was a real guy. And it's like, and this is the kind of, when people say things aren't as good as they used to be, when people say progress is a myth, what they really mean is
when you say progress.
What they really mean is that men like this just don't appear as frequently, or they don't seem to. And so, human excellence. If we were thinking about progress theoretically as, an ever-increasing reservoir of human excellence, you just couldn't realistically make that case, because figures like this are so few and far between. It actually lends itself to a more sort of cyclical view of history, perhaps, as people like Chuck Yeager appear and disappear.
Or perhaps what's different
it's interesting. Maybe it's interesting to think about it in relation to. So, I mean, Chuck Yeager obviously is that hero, but just thinking about the Right Stuff versus a more recent version of that story, or close to version of that story, which is the First Man, the story about Neil Armstrong and Apollo 11. And what I remember very strongly from the Right Stuff is that there are some very sad scenes, right? And in fact, the scene that strikes me the most is one of the funeral scenes when they're singing "Nearer Thy God to Me," I think it is, and after someone's crashed in one of these things. But compare that to First Man, which is a thoroughly downbeat story of an incredible success, again, for both science and progress and heroism and exploration and all that sort of thing. So in the 2010s and 2020s, we have to tell that story, and we have to tell it through the lens of personal tragedy. Whereas even as recently as 1983, we can tell that story as a story of great heroism, where there is sadness, but it is the heroism that comes first.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's you can sort of track American storytelling in a way that the emphasis in First Man is on, I think I mentioned this on this podcast, is that it's on the grueling endurance nature of this kind of work, that it's not all just like, risk-taking is not all fun. There's a lot of preparation. It's
not all just stepping down off the lander onto
and
like, hey, I'm here.
I think that's right, because it really comes through in the Right Stuff, that it's a celebration of this kind of character and what this kind of person is able to achieve.
Do they have the right stuff?
Yeah.
Like imagine actually setting a bar that people have to reach. Do they have the right stuff? If they don't have the right stuff, they're out of the program.
Yeah. And so just a tremendous story of human excellence, and incredibly, the foundation of it is a real man.
Yeah. Vale Chuck Yeager. What a nice note to finish on, and a great movie. And I remember, you couldn't see it at the box office; it was too long, and then it just spread by word of mouth and DVDs, and
that's now one of the it's preserved by the Library of Congress and things. It's considered a classic.
Yeah, pretty awesome. Great choice, Andrew. Thank you for that one. Thank you for yours, Chris. And of course, as we mentioned before, we'll be back next week for what will be the final episode of 2020, and indeed our final episode until further notice, due to all the great plans that we have for 2021. Final reminder today that this is a production of the Institute of Public Affairs. If you'd like to join or donate, please do go to ipa.org.au. I'd like to say a big thank you to my fellow panellists today, Dr. Chris Berg.
Thank you, Scott.
Andrew Bushnell.
Cheers, Scott.
Big shout out to the lads in the control room, particularly Saul today, for all of your work. And we'll be back with more next week.